All right, everybody, welcome back to another edition of Hurricane U. I am Mark Sudduth, and it's good to have Dr. Phil Klotzbach. He's back in Colorado. You see that background behind him. Phil loves Colorado. Before we get started, good to have you back, Phil. But how's Colorado? You're back. You were in California, but you're back in the, what is Colorado known for? You know how Mississippi is like the Magnolia State? Is it the Rocky Mountain State? Is it that simple?
Well, the official is the Centennial State.
There you go.
But it's mostly known for its mountains. So the eastern half of Colorado is very flat.
Right.
And as you move west, there's some pretty impressive mountains. So last I talked to you, were actually living in the mountains. So I think last time I talked to you were about 9,000 feet. Have a little more oxygen now. I'm down just a little bit south of Denver, about 6,000 feet. So still high up, but not quite as high up as the last time we talked. But since then, climbed a few more mountains and just got back from a nice weekend looking at climbing mountains and taking in the fall colors. It was a very impressive fall color display this weekend. I hadn't seen them quite that vibrant. So it was it's really pretty.
Well, I bet you can run a 5K pretty swiftly, can't you?
Oh man, the thing about living at altitude I found is that I have a very good now first gear, but I have no speed whatsoever. I need to start working on that. It's hard to run fast at altitude, so my legs have one speed and it's not very quick.
I understand. All right, well, let's get into several topics here. It's the 2021 hurricane season has been pretty impactful. And as we've been looking at a few things, people talking about a lot of different sort of definitions out there. And I wanted to kind of dig as deep as we could into that with the time that we have. And one of those, we'll start off with ACE. We hear a lot about ACE, the accumulated cyclone energy. Some people kind of dismiss it. They say, ACE is, well, whatever, who's keeping score? That's ridiculous. But I like ACE. I think ACE is a good example. And you and I both talk about sports a lot. I've seen you're a baseball guy and I'm a college basketball guy. And I look at it like, how's the team doing? And so I'm going to turn it over to you. What is ACE? Why it is important? And how do you use it in science?
Yeah, so ACE is basically, it's accumulated cyclone energy. So it's an integrated metric of the frequency, the intensity, and the duration of storms. So if you get a very short-lived weak storm, it generates very little, almost no ACE. And if you get a very, very long-lived hurricane, it generates a tremendous amount of ACE. And so, for example, this year so far, the number one hurricane is Larry for ACE, but Sam is fast approaching Larry and likely will surpass Larry in the next 4 to 5 days, given its forecast to be a major hurricane for another 5 days. And so the reason we actually like to use ACE as opposed to say the number of storms is because it's more indicative of overall kind of what the atmosphere is supporting for the large scale environment. Basically, is a large scale environment conducive for storms to form and to intensify? And so one of the reasons why we have hurricanes is to basically transport energy from the tropics to the mid latitudes and to the polar regions. And tropical cyclones is an efficient way to do that during the summer. And so it's hard to know, basically the environment may be conducive for storms, and it's hard to know necessarily if you're going to have fewer long-lived hurricanes or maybe more short-lived hurricanes, but ACE kind of integrates through that. And so typically long-lived major hurricanes, especially if they're tracking west, can cause a tremendous amount of damage. And so, if you look at ACE, we look at it basin wide, but also if you focus on ACE, say west of, say, 60 degrees west, so in the western half of the basin, that ACE is likely kind of considered like angst ACE because it's going to be close to somebody, whether it's Bermuda, the United States, Caribbean, Central America. So we like ACE because it's a metric that's more easily predictable on a seasonal timescale. And overall, if you look at high ACE years, are typically the ones that are more impactful, whether it be to the United States, Caribbean, Central America.
So what are some of the bigger ACE seasons that we might have remembered out there in the general audience?
Yeah, so the biggest ACE year actually is 1933. We actually wrote a paper on the 1933 hurricane season that got published last year. And so 1933, most people don't remember. I certainly wasn't around in 1933. You weren't around in 33. Bill Gray, he was 4 in 1933. I don't think he remembered it very well. But if you think about, if you look back at that season, it was a tremendously active season. In 1933, we had very limited observational capabilities.
Sure.
We obviously didn't have satellites. We weren't flying aircraft into hurricanes. So we likely probably even missed some. But even with that, it was still an extremely active season. And we had 2 major hurricanes hit the United States less than a day apart. We had a Category 3 hurricane go into near Jupiter, Florida, followed by another one into Brownsville less than a day apart. So an extremely active season, but also extremely active for landfalls. More recent years that were extremely high ACE, 2004, 2005, and 2017 were both very, very high on that metric. 2020 was also high, not quite up to the levels of 04 and 05. And the reason is because 2020 was a very active season, but most of the hurricanes that formed did so in the Western Atlantic. So even though they reached intense levels, they didn't have that duration component. So they didn't necessarily generate as much ACE as, for example, Sam was likely to generate much more ACE than did any of the individual storms that formed in 2020.
That's incredible. So one storm, Sam, that's pretty remarkable. So individually, how about some hurricanes historically that have produced tremendous amounts of ACE? Some of them, and I see you tweet this often, you're the statistics guru. We love it out there in weather Twitter, as we call it. So what are some of the higher ACE producing hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin on an individual basis that we could reflect on?
Yeah, so the highest one since satellite data was Hurricane Ivan in 2004, which formed pretty much right off the coast of Africa and went all the way across. And then it was a very powerful hurricane that went up into the Gulf of Mexico and eventually made landfall just west of the Alabama-Florida border as a Category 3 hurricane. But I think it was a major hurricane for about 10 days. So it generated a huge amount of ACE that went across. In more recent memory, Hurricane Irma was a huge ACE generator, and that's because it was a long-lived hurricane. It felt like it was Category 5 hurricane for a week, and obviously Irma is a good example of an ACE storm that, as it went along, one island after the other just pummeled one island right after the other, and obviously caused a tremendous amount of damage. More recently, even Hurricane Dorian generated a lot of ACE, and also one of my colleagues, Ryan, who runs Weather Tiger, basically ran an analysis and found Hurricane Dorian generated more ACE in like a 1 degree by 1 degree grid box than any other hurricane. And unfortunately, it was like over Grand Bahama and Abaco. And that's a great example of where ACE really matters, because you had a Category 5 hurricane parked over a landmass. And because it was mostly water, it caused a tremendous amount of damage and didn't weaken hardly at all. And so that's when you really see what ACE can do, basically just winds just pummeling this area for hour after hour after hour. So, if ACE out in the middle of the ocean is interesting to me, but it probably doesn't really impact people, but you can get these storms that are slow moving major hurricanes that are generating all that kinetic energy that then destroys stuff and causes storm surge and all the other stuff.
All right, moving on. So related to the ACE, we have the next 3-letter word that starts with A, and that is AMO. And this is something that I learned about a long time ago. I think all the way back to 1995, the year I graduated from college, and I stumbled across Dr. Gray's work on some websites that I was researching hurricanes on and about for a client, my very first client. It was Wilmington Industrial Development, a local economic development firm. They wanted me to create a paper telling potential industry and businesses why it is safe, quote unquote, move to Southeast North Carolina, that we don't have a hurricane problem. And I was like, yeah, but there's this guy in Colorado, and wait a minute, Colorado, et cetera. He says this warm AMO is coming and so forth. And that's the first time I was exposed to it. So kind of related, when the AMO, and we're going to get into it, when that's, positive, et cetera, you can have some higher ACE. These are all related, aren't they? So tell us about the AMO, please.
Yeah, so the AMO is the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, and it's basically periods where the Atlantic tends to be warmer than normal, and especially warmer relative to the rest of the tropics. And so since 1995, in general, the Atlantic has been warmer relative to the rest of the tropics. So you have more active overall Atlantic hurricane seasons. And so, if you said 1995, the North Carolina had been pretty quiet through 95. And then obviously the next year, I don't need to tell you the storms that had, obviously Hurricane Fran being the most notable in 96, but obviously the late 90s were extremely active along the North Carolina coast. And so basically what happens is when the Atlantic is warmer than normal, that obviously, when you have a warmer than normal Atlantic, that provides more fuel for storms, but also tends to be associated with lower pressures and a more unstable atmosphere. Also, a warmer Atlantic, especially when it's combined with a La Niña, which is colder water in the eastern and central tropical Pacific, tends to reduce vertical wind shear. And that's something if you ever read a Hurricane Center forecast discussion, I don't think they ever produced this discussion that didn't talk about wind shear. And basically, shear is change in wind direction and speed with height in the atmosphere. And so normally in the Atlantic, your low level winds blow out of the east. In the tropics, they blow out of the east, and in upper levels, they blow out of the west. So if you think about it in a vertical, you have a shear, low level winds blowing one way, upper level winds blowing the other. And so too much of that shear basically tilts the hurricane circulation and disrupts it and tears it apart. And we even saw it with Sam a little bit last night. Not a tremendous amount of shear, but enough shear, since it's a very tight circulation, really jacked it up, and it's finally recovering about 12 hours later. So when you have this AMO positive, you tend to have less overall vertical wind shear. And so the million-dollar question is, when is this AMO going to end, or not end? When is it going to flip back to the colder phase? And so that's certainly still kind of unsure at this point. We went through a 3-year period from 2013 to 15 that was pretty quiet. But since 2015, 2016 through 2020 all officially met the NOAA definition of an above average hurricane season. And assuming the Hurricane Center's forecast for Sam is correct, even if we get nothing else, we should already meet the NOAA threshold for an above average season just with Sam. So, and obviously there's still several weeks left to go. We likely will have more storms. So we're very likely to have another officially above average Atlantic hurricane season. And again, that'll make 6 in a row.
Well, it seems like the Atlantic really warmed up in the last couple of months here. And we were talking about it, especially on different message boards like Storm 2K. Been around a long time, that message board. A lot of knowledgeable people there that kind of know all these definitions and terminologies. And we've noticed that it's kind of got that horseshoe look, that warm horseshoe look, that it's not just down in the tropics, the MDR as we call it, but it really up into the Northeast Atlantic, even areas south of Greenland. And it's really come on strong lately. Is this surprising to you that it's really warmed up? I mean, it's noticeable, especially if you look, and it depends on which particular background state data set you're looking at, CDAS versus the Coral Reef Watch, which used to be the NOAA NESDIS. That's my favorite one, by the way. It just seems to be the most consistent, but that's a story for another day. But you can really see it, clearly this warm anomaly set up all across the Atlantic basin, but that horseshoe sticks out there. Again, does this come as a surprise to you and your team?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we were expecting a warmer than normal, but really even in the last 2 to 3 weeks, we've seen a tremendous amount of warming in the deep tropics. And I think when I ran the numbers last week, I think we were, if you look at the eastern and central tropical Atlantic, so basically anywhere from the west coast of Africa to the Lesser Antilles, we basically it was the second warmest past to basically mid-September on record, trailing only 2005, and it escalated very, very quickly. It was really impressive, and so we generally had fairly weak low-level winds. So when you have trade winds that blow from east to west across the Atlantic, when those are strong, causes a lot of mixing, churning up of the ocean surface, causes cooling. Last few weeks, the winds have generally been weaker than normal, so that's really has helped to cause basically anomalous warming. So the tropical Atlantic right now is quite warm. Now, when you get hurricanes, you'll see what's called a cold wake, because obviously you have your low level winds blowing across the Atlantic, but if you want to talk about serious mixing, you talk about a hurricane. So especially Hurricane Larry left a very pronounced cold wake because it was a large hurricane, it was a beautifully shaped donut looking hurricane, and caused a lot of churning up of cold water. And so usually, 2, even 3 weeks after a hurricane, you'll see basically a cold wake. And we saw that in the Gulf of Mexico after, it was interesting because we had Hurricane Grace, which went into Bay of Campeche and then went into southern Mexico, and then followed fairly soon thereafter by Hurricane Ida. And so if you looked at the Gulf of Mexico after those 2 storms, it was actually a little bit colder than normal across most of the Gulf because you had all that mixing between those 2 storms. And then you had Nicholas, which obviously was not nearly an Ida, but still caused quite a bit of mixing as it churned up the Gulf as well. So the Gulf isn't necessarily super warm right now, but the tropical Atlantic and the Caribbean is warm. And unfortunately, when you have a warm Caribbean combined with a colder than normal eastern and central tropical Pacific, that unfortunately can lead to a pretty active late hurricane season. And so that's something we're obviously following very closely as we move past the peak of the season, but we still have October and November to go.
So that leads me into this part about the tropical Pacific, that we're not officially in the La Niña. I guess the government, CPC, or somebody has to declare that. But boy, you look at the Atlantic, but you also juxtapose that to the tropical Pacific, and that cold area down there really stands out. Has this exceeded your expectations and any, I mean, it's been evolving, but I mean, this really come on robust as well, kind of they're part and parcel with what's happening in the Atlantic seems to spell that, yes, we could really be looking at hurricane activity through October into November. I mean, yes, the hurricane season runs through November 30th, but we could have some bona fide problems or hopefully all fish storms, hurricanes, et cetera. But, through October, November, but that La Niña, I mean, it's not again official yet, but seems to be really coming on strong as well.
Yeah, I mean, so from an atmospheric perspective, it certainly looks like it's there. Overall, we've generally had sinking motion over the most of the Pacific, well, the Eastern and Central Pacific Ocean, the Eastern Pacific hurricane season, which was fairly robust the last time we talked in early August, and now has gone very, very, very quiet. We're at one of the quietest Septembers on record for the Eastern Pacific. We're likely to only have one storm all month. And so if you look at the low-level winds blowing across the tropical Pacific Ocean, they've been extremely strong. They're basically, and so when you have these strong winds, again, you promote mixing and churning up of the ocean surface, and that's likely to cause, it's already caused some cooling, I think it cause a lot more. If you look at the, the Climate Prediction Center has figures that talk about upper ocean heat content. So it's not just the water at the ocean surface, but down to about 300 meters. That's even colder now than it was last year at this time. So certainly, I expect we'll see those colder waters coming to this, or you'll see these sea surface temperature anomalies going down very, very quickly, especially with these very strong winds that are likely to persist for the next couple of weeks based on the latest model forecast. So I suspect, unfortunately, from that perspective, we're likely to see, a La Nina combined with a warm, especially a warm Caribbean late in the season, tends to basically spin up what's known as a low-level gyre or a low-level area, basically cyclonic spin. And so when these often what happens late in the season is you get systems coming off Africa, and they don't normally form right off Africa in October, but what they'll do is they'll just kind of tool along, get into the Caribbean, get into that really nice warm water. If you have a La Nina, generally a fairly low shear environment, and then you get these storms spinning up. And obviously last year was basically crazy October, November on steroids, with 5 major hurricanes in October and November. And certainly we hope and don't expect necessarily to see 5 major hurricanes in October, November, but obviously, even if you get 1 or 2, the problem is, unfortunately, when they form in the Western Atlantic and the Caribbean, they're extremely likely to cause impacts somewhere, whether it be, Central America, islands in the Caribbean, or potentially up in the United States. So there's not a ton of model support for anything yet, but it's early. And also, too, the models don't always go crazy. And I sent out a long email last year at this time to various my colleagues, scientists, friends, and I looked at it and I was talking about it, and like, the models are kind of hemming and hawing, and I said I think it should be pretty active. But even late September last year, I didn't anticipate 5 major hurricanes in October and November. So certainly I wouldn't necessarily expect to see a repeat of 2020, but I would certainly at this point we do expect to see probably above normal activity in the last 2 months of the season. And also right now, I should add, we have Sam out there now. We're likely to have 2 other systems coming off Africa forming, which would be very impressive as well.
So what do you think made the Atlantic sort of respond the way that it has? Why did it warm up? I mean, it definitely exceeded my expectations. We saw some of the modeling earlier on. We've seen, the stuff that Ben Knoll puts out as far back as April, and a lot of the different parameters that you will focus the CSU forecast on, that you cite the different reasons. But I mean, really, this seems to be, especially like you said, the last few weeks. And I know you said we know it's the general lack of trade winds, but what's the background reason? Do we have a handle on that yet? Like, what's causing the cause?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know exactly. So in general, we've had basically, so you have, in addition to like La Nina and El Nino, you also have subseasonal variability. And one of those big drivers is this Madden-Julian oscillation. And so basically it's thunderstorm activity that propagates around the globe about every 30 to 70 days in the tropics. And so this year, it's kind of basically been stuck, and then it's basically forced upward motion over Africa and the Indian Ocean, and sinking motion over the Pacific, especially the last few weeks. And when that occurs, if you have upward motion over Africa, to get upward motion, you have to have low-level winds converging into that. And so on the western side, they're going to be coming out of the west, and then the eastern side, they're coming out of the east. And so if you think about this, you have low-level flow out of the west, basically converging with the low-level flow to the east, and then it goes up, and that's where you get your thunderstorms. But if you have air going up over Africa, the air the low-level winds over the Atlantic have to be blowing out of the west, and that's one of the likely reasons why we've seen it. And so,
Right.
why did the MJO stall? I mean, some of it I think is truly just because it's been the La Nina is like basically, so while officially we're not La Nina a lot yet, the atmosphere has been responding in the La Nina like mode, and the MJO just hasn't really been able to propagate. And so basically the MJO has kind of been stuck in favorable phases for the Atlantic, which is one of the reasons why since August 11th, we got Fred on August 11th, and now we've already gone through T, and probably will be a V and W in the next week. So again, a lot of those storms have been weak and short-lived, but we've also seen 4 major hurricanes, which is a lot. So there's some people say, oh, it's been a lot of junk, and yeah, there has been a lot of junk, but certainly I don't think we could say that Grace or Ida or Larry or certainly Sam are junk.
Right.
Legit major hurricanes. So it's certainly been an active season.
So it's interesting, though, that we look back at prior busy seasons, and I see that you will oftentimes whittle these down. We're getting into some pretty rare territory here, that where we are now, there's only so many seasons that were like this or whatever. What would you place the odds that maybe 2021 ends up in the top 3, so to speak, that we could, I know last year we had 30 named storms, but that ace for this year could eclipse last year if we have a very busy, intense October. You just said a little while ago there that the subsurface of the tropical Pacific is even colder than it was this time last year. So this La Nina sort of state could really come on. And it just seems to me that the Caribbean is also pretty similar to where it was last year. Just a lot of ingredients there that we could still, we have all of October in front of us. It's a little bit unnerving. And even into November, we had Hurricane Kate in 1985 that was not early November either. What is, I don't want to say your gut, because we want to stick to science here, but there seems to be some indications here that we could really put 2021 on the Mount Rushmore of some big hurricane seasons. It's already close to it, but it might solidify that, so to speak. What do you think about that? I mean, we've got a long ways to go in the game, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly a number of storms we're going to be, we're already, like top 5, and certainly we're extremely likely to exhaust the normal alphabet for the Atlantic hurricane season, probably by the end of the month or October 1st or 2nd.
Mm-hmm.
So then, you're already talking that you have the, above the only year you have above you is, you're starting to compare with 2005 and 2020.
Right.
In terms of hurricane numbers, we're currently sitting at 7, maybe one of these 2 systems that are coming off Africa, maybe one of those will be 8. So I don't think we'll necessarily be rivaling the 14 that we had last year or the 15 that we had in 2005. But if you look at things like major hurricane days, so the number of days we have major hurricanes, we've already surpassed last year. And that's because, again, last year we had a lot of major hurricanes, but they were generally only major hurricanes for about a day because they were slamming into something, which obviously from an impact perspective last year was huge, especially Laura in the US and then especially late in the Caribbean. Now, in terms of what the next few weeks are going to look like, we have Sam, which is going to be out there for probably another 5-6 days. Then you have 2 systems coming off Africa. After that, it does look like it's going to be quieter. This MJO that we talked about does look like it's finally going to at least propagate somewhat. I don't think it's going to be a huge signal, but that should probably cause the Atlantic to get quieter for a week or so. But then it looks like those conditions will become more conducive around October 10th, 15th. And so it's really hard to say. Last year it was just basically last year it was pretty much one right after the other. We had very little break. The Caribbean was like every single thing just formed in the Caribbean and blew up, and like Eta went, and then Iota felt like it was carbon copy of Eta. What was it, 10 days later or whatever. Not say we're going to see that again, but I certainly would not be surprised to see 1 or maybe 2 nasty stuff coming out of the Caribbean. Just given again, you're going to have very likely to have officially a La Nina by middle of October, late October. But regardless of whether they officially designate a La Nina, the atmosphere is certainly responding in a La Nina-like manner in the Caribbean. While not as warm as last year, is still quite healthy, quite robustly warm. And that also has come on strong the last couple of weeks, probably somewhat due to the fact we haven't had any storms down there, causing the mixing and churning up. So, and that's one of the reasons why I think last year in the Caribbean, it was so hot by the end of September, is because we had, I guess, a Nana. But other than that, it was almost a Caribbean was very quiet and had plenty of time to just kind of cook. And then October came around and it was even hotter than a bathtub. So this year, again, it's warm there. We're likely to, again, to be, we're cool neutral, but probably going to be La Nina in the next few weeks,
Yeah.
given how quick stuff is transitioning. So again, certainly the atmosphere is responding in a La Nina-like manner. So I would say at least, it looks like probably early October should be fairly quiet after these three systems, but then probably I would expect to see something I'd be definitely watching the Caribbean. I don't see a ton of model signals in there yet, but the models sometimes are a little lagging in the spinning up of storms in the Caribbean. So we'll see.
Well, as always, I appreciate your time and explaining some of these concepts. It's fascinating, and we always learn a lot. And you just, again, that deep dive into sort of what these things mean. We see these three-letter acronyms everywhere often, and we talk about them briefly in updates and small Twitter posts. And so it's just fantastic that you take some time from beautiful Colorado out there behind you. Did you take that picture, by the way? Is that yours?
No, I think this may have been my wife's picture. She takes most of the pictures. This is actually from California, not Colorado. Colorado doesn't usually get this screen. I may have to change. I'll change my screen background to put up the fall colors from Colorado. This background just works well as a virtual background because it doesn't look like my ears are flying in and out of the picture.
Right. I remember now. That reminds me of that picture behind you. I've said on Facebook before that, you're enjoying some time in the Shire.
It does. Yes. Where I used to live in the Bay Area, in the East Bay, definitely if you got a good wet December, January, it could be like 3 months where you literally did feel like you were in the Shire. You're out there looking for hobbits.
Fantastic stuff. Well, Dr. Phil Klotzbach, thanks for spending some time with us again. We'll see what the rest of the season holds. And, as they say, luck favors the prepared. We will all be ready. We'll be watching, and we'll see what your stats show when it's all said and done at the end of the season.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Mark. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.